Hi guys, today I'm going to be doing a lens review of the Canon 70-300mm f4 to 5.6 L zoom lens, and I'm going to start right now. Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. My name is James, and if it is the very first time to this channel and you want to learn all about Photoshop, Lightroom and everything photography related, start now by subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss anything. So in this video guys, I'm going to be doing a lens review of the Canon EF 70-300mm f4 to 5.6 L zoom lens. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this review down into 5 separate parts to really work out if this very lens is worth a spot in your camera bag. And I'm also going to do a few lens comparisons to lenses of similar price points and similar focal distances to really work out if this lens is the one for you. So without further ado guys, let's get started. So just before I start talking about the build quality of this lens, I just want to start talking about the lens accessories that you get inside the box. So this lens, you get a felt lens pouch, a front and rear lens cap with a premium plastic lens hood. Now, unlike other telephoto L-mount lenses that come with this really nice waterproof padded bag, this lens does not. Instead, you get this felt bag, which is more like a pouch and is a bit underwhelming, especially if you compare it to other lenses of similar focal distance and price that is made by Canon. The lens hood is incredibly well made and is very durable with a black felt lining, and this lining is designed to help reduce flaring and loss of contrast. So apart from the lens pouch, the accessories you get with this lens are incredibly well made, and I was really happy with the build quality. So the first thing I want to talk about is the build quality of this lens. So this lens is made out of a premium plastic, aluminium and magnesium construction. This makes this lens incredibly well built, but more on the heavier side. The lens also boasts an impressive amount of weather sealing at 15 different locations, which is great if you're planning on taking this lens in a more wet or even a dusty environment. This lens also has 2 rubberized rings. The first ring, which is the ring closest towards you, is the focus ring. This ring is incredibly well damped and is super easy to change the focus. The other ring is the zoom ring. This lens does not have internal zooming and does increase the size when it is fully zoomed out, unlike other Canon telephoto lenses such as the Canon 70-200mm. This lens zooms from 70mm, which is medium telephoto, to 300mm, which is super telephoto. The zoom ring is incredibly smooth and is easy to turn even with just 2 fingers. This lens also has 3 designated buttons found on the left hand side. These buttons allow you to change some of the lens settings from autofocus, image stabilization and image stabilization options. These buttons are incredibly well made and they are also waterproof. This lens also includes a focus window, which makes it a little bit easier to change the focal distance when you're doing it manually. Overall, I was incredibly impressed with the build quality of this lens, and this is by far one of the best built lenses that I have seen from Canon to date. This lens truly is a tank. So for that reason, I'm going to be giving this lens a 10 out of 10 for build quality. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about is the image quality of this lens. So this lens is a variable aperture zoom lens, meaning the more you zoom, the less light reaches the sensor. This lens has a variable aperture range from f4 to 5.6, which in the grand scheme of things is actually quite narrow, especially if you compare it to the Canon 70-200mm f2.8. This lens has a lot wider aperture compared to this lens. This lens also has the same variable aperture range compared to the non-L equivalent lens, coming in at just 1/3 of the price. So how does this lens compare to the cheaper counterpart? Well, firstly, this lens is incredibly sharp. Wide open at 70mm, you really can see how sharp this lens truly is, with very little colour fringing and vignetting. The sharpness continues throughout the entire zoom range all the way to the corners, especially at 300mm. I must say this is by far one of the sharpest Canon super telephoto lenses I have tested, especially if you compare it to the more expensive 70-200mm f2.8, which I found quite soft in the corners at 2.8. This lens also boasts an impressive amount of image stabilization, up to 4 stops of light, which is great if you want to use this lens in nighttime without using a tripod. The only downside when it comes to image quality is the high aperture. With this high aperture of 5.6, it is quite difficult to take out of focus backgrounds or bokeh. The only way to create the out of focus smooth background is by using the compression of this lens at 300mm. You can use the compression to really break out your subject against the background, making the background nice and smooth, although I did sometimes find it was quite difficult to render it in an appealing way. So if you are after a lens with smoother, more professional looking bokeh, then I would recommend the Canon 70-200mm, as this has a lot shallower depth of field because of the lower aperture of f2.8. The other downside to this lens is it does suffer from quite bad distortion. At 70mm you can really see how bad the barrel distortion is, especially if you compare it to other 70mm lenses. And then if you zoom in at 300mm, that distortion flips from barrel to pincushion distortion, which again is very unusual to find a lens at this focal distance. Now overall I was impressed with the sharpness of the lens, and with the incredibly handy focal distance of 70-300mm, this lens is great for all types of photographers. And the only downside to this lens is the high aperture from f4 to 5.6 and the high amount of distortion throughout the entire image frame. So for that reason I'm only going to be giving this lens an 8 out of 10 for image quality. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about is the size and weight of this lens. Now because of the build quality of this lens, made out of heavier materials such as aluminium and magnesium, this lens is actually quite heavy for its size, weighing in at over a kilogram, at 1050 grams or 2.31 pounds in the US. The good point about this lens is the actual physical size. The lens is a lot smaller compared to the 70-200mm f2.8 lens, which means you're going to be able to fit it into most camera bags fairly easily. This lens also has quite a small filter thread, coming in at just 67mm. This is great as the price of 67mm filter threads are incredibly cheap, especially if you compare it to the Canon 70-200mm f2.8, which has a filter thread of 77mm. The only downside to this lens is the girth. This lens is quite thick, making it quite difficult to hold, especially if you've got smaller hands. But overall, this lens is quite small, especially if you compare it to other L super telephoto lenses. So apart from the heavyweight design of this lens and the girth of this lens is actually quite a good size, especially for its focal distance. So for that reason, I'm going to be giving it a 7 out of 10 for size and weight. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about is the focus motor and image stabilization. So because of this lens is part of the L series lenses that Canon make, these are the flagship lenses and the most expensive, this lens has the upgraded focus motor compared to the non-L equivalent lens. This lens has the upgraded ultrasonic motor, which is a lot more precise and a lot quicker, especially in low light. This lens also has an upgraded image stabilization system, up to 4 stops of light. It also boasts 2 image stabilization modes. Mode 1 is for more general purpose photography and what you're going to be using around 90% of the time. Mode 2 is designed for when you're either panning or tracking subjects. Option 2 provides a lot more successful image stabilization when you're either panning or tracking moving subjects, such as animals or even airplanes. This is great to see for a lens of this price. Now, the only downside to this lens is the sound of the ultrasonic motor and image stabilization when in use. So if you're going to use this lens for video, I would highly recommend using either an external microphone, such as a shotgun microphone, or even using a lapel microphone. These types of microphone will help reduce the amount of whirring and clicking sounds that this lens makes, especially when the image stabilization is on. I must say, I was incredibly impressed with the speed and accuracy of the focus motor. This lens is great if you're planning on wanting to have a lens to shoot wildlife or even sports photography. And because of the impressive amount of image stabilization, this is easy to get good, sharp images even at low light. So for that reason, I'm going to be giving this lens an 8 out of 10 for its focus motor and image stabilization. So last but most importantly is the price. Now, when this lens was first announced, I was expecting it to be more of a budget orientated L lens, an L lens for all photographers. I was really hoping that this lens was going to be under £1,000, but when this lens was released with quite a high price tag, coming in at £1,329, I was a bit disappointed, especially when you compare it to other lenses with similar focal distances. The Canon 70-300mm f4 to 5.6 non-L version comes in at just £499, almost 3 times cheaper. And the only real difference is the build quality, weather sealing and upgraded optical performance compared to the non-L version. And to be honest, I really don't see this lens being 3 times better than the non-L equivalent. But if you are after a purpose-built super telephoto zoom lens which has great build quality, weather sealing and an upgraded focus motor, then you can't go wrong with this 70-300mm. But with the high price tag, I can't realistically recommend this lens over the non-L equivalent, which is a great budget zoom lens from Canon. The only upside when it comes to price is the filter thread, coming in at just 67mm for this super telephoto lens. The cheapest UV filter I found was a Hoya 67mm NX10 UV filter, coming in at just £28.95, a saving of almost £40 compared to the 77mm equivalent. And if you want a circular polarizer filter, the cheapest one that I found was a Hoya 67mm NX10 circular polarizer filter, coming in at £64.95, a big saving, especially if you compare it to larger filters for larger lenses. So for that reason, I'm only going to be giving this lens a 6 out of 10, as I would choose the non-L equivalent lens for the amazing value for money. Brilliant, and there we go guys. So that is my lens review of the Canon EF 70-300mm f4 to 5.6 L zoom lens. Now, with a respectable score of 39 out of 50, this is a recommended lens to have in your camera bag, especially if you are after an incredibly well-built lens with superior optics over the non-L version. But if you are after a 70-300mm, I would highly recommend using the non-L version, as it is a lot better value for money, as this lens really is one of the most expensive 70-300mm out on the market. So unless you're after the superior optics and build quality, the non-L version will be perfect for you, and I'm going to be doing a future review on that lens. Again guys, if you want to like, comment and subscribe to my channel, it really does help my channel grow. Also, if you want to hit the bell notification so you don't miss any of my latest content. But until next time guys, keep creating.